Straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily. A deadly shooting spree in Memphis, Tennessee.
The people of our city were confronted with the type of violence no one should have to face.
What we know so far about the suspect and the disappearance and death of Eliza Fletcher. Suspect Cleotha Abston appears in court for the third day in a row. Plus, a surprising arrest in the murder of a Las Vegas investigative reporter.
This has been an unusual case from the beginning. The murder of an investigative journalist and the main suspect, an elected official.
And later, the Pike County Massacre, a deeper dive into the lives of the Wagner family as we look ahead to the trial of George Wagner IV. Law and Crime Daily, covering court cases from coast to coast. And welcome, everybody, to Law and Crime Daily. I'm Brian Ross, sitting in today for Brian Buckmeyer. We begin with news out of Memphis, where people in that city of more than 1 million residents were ordered to shelter in place after a gunman live-streamed a shooting spree on Facebook. It happened on Wednesday when officials say 19-year-old Ezekiel Kelly started the deadly spree just before 1 o'clock in the morning. They say Kelly traveled from the east side of the city to the south side and then back again, in all creating at least 8 separate crime scenes. At one point, they say, the gunman live-streamed a shooting on Facebook. When a concerned citizen called in that tip, Memphis police launched a citywide search for Kelly, who they described as armed and dangerous. The bus and trolley systems were also suspended as law enforcement urged residents to stay inside. After carjacking a number of vehicles and leading investigators on a high-speed chase, Kelly was arrested just before 9 o'clock Wednesday evening. At a press conference, Memphis Mayor Jim Strickland said Kelly was released from a 3-year prison sentence early, back in March of this year, after accepting a plea deal for a charge of criminal attempted first-degree murder.
These evil actions show why truth in sentencing is a must. And we should do all we can to make our city safe. We should not be terrorized by anyone. Anyone who wants to strike fear in our hearts and take away what we love about Memphis. We must unite around this principle and stand up to the challenge of violent crime in our city. If Mr. Kelly served his full 3-year sentence, he would still be in prison today, and 4 of our fellow citizens would still be alive.
Joining us now is co-host Terry Austin and criminal defense attorney Jack Rice in Minnesota. Jack, let me start with you. This mass shooting was carried out in at least 8 separate locations. That's quite a challenge now for law enforcement as they gather up evidence, isn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not just the 8 crime scenes, it's all the space in between, right? So normally what we want to see is if you see a enclosed crime scene, you can coordinate it, quarantine it off, and then work your way inward from there. The problem that we have here is it stretches from east side to the south and back. And now you're trying to compare those, look at those. Some of these obviously tied to one individual, but not necessarily always. So you're having to do a lot of work on this, and exponentially it becomes much more difficult.
Terry Austin, as we heard the mayor say, Kelly was previously charged with attempted first-degree murder, but pleaded to a lesser charge and was released after serving just 11 months. The mayor said if they had kept him in jail for his full 3-year sentence, 4 victims would still be alive today. Do you agree with that?
I actually disagree with him on that statement. Look, I agree that a lot has to be done to make sure these types of crimes don't happen again. But it does seem as though Kelly was a time bomb just waiting to happen. And whether he served 11 months or 3 years, he clearly was not rehabilitated. And the previous charges, when he was only 17, he was 19 now, but the previous charges included attempted first-degree murder, aggravated assault, and reckless endangerment with a firearm. So although that prior attack did not end in a death, it does show his capacity for hate and for violence. And so one of the things I think we need to do is determine how came into possession of that firearm. Plus, we have to figure out what the motive was. And if he needs mental help, then that's one of the things I think we should do. Those are the things that could probably prevent a crime like this from happening.
All right, thank you, Terry Austin, Jack Rice. Turning now to South Carolina, where a lawsuit involving the ongoing Alec Murdaugh saga will head to trial next month, without anyone from the Murdaugh family being involved. The suit involves a wrongful death complaint from the family of 19-year-old Mallory Beach, who died in a boating accident in February of 2019. The boat, allegedly driven by a drunk and underage Paul Murdaugh and owned by his father, the disgraced attorney Alec Murdaugh, slammed into a bridge piling, ejecting all 6 passengers and killing Beach. The lawsuit was filed against both the Murdaughs and the owner of the convenience store where Paul purchased the alcohol while underage. Murdaugh previously requested the wrongful death case be separated from his other charges, that he shot and killed his wife Maggie and their son Paul years after the boat accident. A judge granted the request, saying the case that Beach's family filed against the convenience store will go to trial October 10th, while the suit against Murdaugh will be delayed until next year. Still ahead on Law and Crime Daily, an elected official is arrested for the murder of a veteran Las Vegas reporter. But first, the man accused of Eliza Fletcher's abduction and murder appears in court for the 3rd day in a row. And welcome back. The suspect in the abduction and murder of Memphis, Tennessee teacher Eliza Fletcher appears in court for the 3rd time in 3 days for a motions hearing over a possible conflict of interest with the public defender's office. 38-year-old Cleotha Abston was initially charged with kidnapping and tampering with evidence, but that was later charged to first-degree murder when Fletcher's body was found days after she went missing. Investigators say 34-year-old Fletcher was last seen alive on Friday, September 2nd. Just after 4 a.m. in the morning while out on a run. She was forced into a black SUV. Investigators later determined Abston was driving the vehicle. He was arrested on Saturday. On Monday, Fletcher's body was found near an abandoned home. Thursday morning, he was arraigned on charges of murder, and the judge determined that the Shelby County Public Defender's Office will represent Abston, despite the fact that they represented him in 2001 when he pleaded guilty for a separate kidnapping charge for which he served 20 years in prison. Abston is set to return to court Monday, September 19th. So Terry, Abston already served 20 years in prison for a prior kidnapping charge. So much for the concept of rehabilitation. Is there any test, any way to determine if inmates are no longer a threat to the community?
That's an excellent question, Brian. And this is yet another tragic case happening in Memphis. And like the mass shooting we just talked about, you have to wonder, what was the motive here? And could this death have been prevented? He actually served the 20 years, as you mentioned, and that was for aggravated kidnapping. And that's a crime that's punishable in Tennessee by 8 to 30 years. He served 20. So he served a good amount of time. One could argue that that was sufficient amount of time. Plus, you know, he has constitutional rights, as does any defendant, for equal protection, due process. But perhaps we should have looked at this prisoner. We should have made sure that he was rehabilitated. We should have looked at whether or not he might need some mental help. And one of the things I think we can think about is, just like a parole board looks at people who get out early, perhaps we can look at individuals who are getting out of jail, trying to make sure they don't return, and asking them questions which will help us determine whether or not they are actually really ready to get out for release and whether they'll be safe for the community that they are living in.
Right. Jack Rice, Tennessee is a death penalty state. What's the likelihood the prosecution in this case will seek the death penalty?
When we think about the death penalty and we think about this particular case, it's a stranger on stranger case in the first place. It's a murder case. It may even be a sexual assault case simply because they found clothing, her shorts, in a bag separate from that. That's a piece of this. That could make it the death penalty. But as importantly, you can look at his prior record and you look at the 20 years that he already served. When you combine all of that, this is the kind of case where people will look at it and they will say, yes, the death penalty could apply. It's first-degree murder. The options are life without parole, life with the possibility of parole, or, as you just asked, the death penalty. That's exactly what this prosecutor is talking about right now.
All right, Jack Rice, Terry Austin, thank you so much. Moving north now to Canada, the search for the second suspect in a string of fatal stabbings dies following his arrest after he and his brother allegedly killed 10 people and injured more than a dozen others in Saskatchewan province. Officials say brothers Miles and Damian Sanderson are responsible for the Sunday morning stabbing attacks that took place across 13 different locations. Officials say some of the victims may have been targeted by the suspects, while others were attacked at random. They say the victims range in age from 23 to 78. On Monday, authorities announced that one of the suspects, Damian, was found dead with injuries that are not believed to have been self-inflicted. Late Wednesday night, the other brother, Miles, was taken into custody after he stole a woman's car and led police on a high-speed chase. He later died from what were called self-inflicted injuries, according to officials. Around 10 victims remain in the hospital. Some are still in critical condition. Coming up on Law and Crime Daily, we look ahead to opening statements in the Pike County massacre case out of Ohio. Plus, investigative reporter Jeff Gurman is stabbed to death outside his home. Now police have arrested a local politician who was the subject of the reporter's investigative stories. Welcome back to Law and Crime Daily and a shocking murder story out of Las Vegas, where police have arrested a local politician in the murder of an investigative reporter. Prize-winning investigative reporter Jeff Gurman of the Las Vegas Review-Journal was stabbed to death outside his home on Saturday.
Because of the relentless follow-up of our detectives and with your help, I'm here to announce the arrest of 45-year-old Robert Tellis. This is a terrible and jarring homicide, one that has deeply impacted Las Vegas. Every murder is tragic, but the killing of a journalist is particularly troublesome. We hope the arrest of Tellis and his subsequent prosecution will ultimately provide a sense of justice for our community and Mr. Gurman's family.
Earlier this week, police released images of a suspect seen in Gurman's neighborhood in a bright orange shirt and a wide-brimmed hat hiding his face. Gurman, known for his hard-hitting investigations of government corruption and the mob, had recently published a series of investigative stories on Tellis, accusing the official of abusing the resources of his office, bullying staff, and having an inappropriate relationship with a female staffer who was seen in the backseat of a car with Tellis, who is married. Tellis, who lost his bid for re-election following the newspaper expose, strongly denied the charges in an interview with Gurman, later lashing out against the reporter on Twitter. Earlier today, I spoke with Las Vegas Review-Journal investigative reporter Art Kane, who worked side by side with Gurman. Jeff was a hell of a reporter, and according to what we're seeing so far, that's what got him killed.
That's what it appears to be. I'll tell you, I'm surprised. We thought it was probably a robbery gone bad until yesterday when it all came down to being this guy who he wrote about. But to have an elected official kill a journalist for a story he did, a fair story, an accurate story, no corrections, is just completely appalling and unheard of.
Indeed. Tellis was last seen being carried out of his home on a stretcher and put into an ambulance as he was arrested. So, Terry, any murder is disturbing, but as the Las Vegas officials say, this was the murder of an investigative reporter doing his job. Should there be harsher punishments for this type of murder as with police or court personnel?
Oh, I definitely think so. All murders, like you said, Brian, are disturbing, but there's something particularly heinous when you murder an authority or a public official or a police officer, and I will include in that group investigative reporters like yourself. These are public servants, and they're simply doing their jobs, and their roles are critical to our society, for the orderly function of our society. And many states, frankly, because of that, have special codes, penal codes that have stricter penalties for the murder of police officers, public officials, firefighters, emergency workers. And those codes say that when you kill someone who is in one of those categories, you will get a harsher sentence. New York, for instance, has that type of penal code. So I definitely think that reporters should be in that category, and it is disturbing to think that a public official could actually kill someone who is simply writing a story.
Right. Jack, as you know, the irony here is that Gurman, who reported extensively on the mafia, was never really threatened by the mobsters, who, of course, have a track record of violence. So do you think the news of this tragic murder will have a chilling effect on other investigative journalists who are out there pursuing controversial stories?
I certainly hope not, because we realize the contribution that journalists have in society to put this mirror up against those and say, who are we? What are we doing? Why are we doing it? That is critical. But it's always odd because when we think about some of the threats that come at people, you'd imagine they'd come from some places. Like in the criminal world, one of the places we sometimes would expect would be serious criminal offenses. That's not where they come from. The lawyers who are actually facing the biggest threats are frequently family lawyers, those who, because of emotional connections, because of somebody whose life is spinning out of control, it makes it that much harder. That always makes it really unusual.
It really does. You know, Jack, as an investigative reporter for decades, I have been slugged, punched, but never had a death threat. When we come back, the Pike County Massacre. Law and Crime Network's Anjanette Levy gives us a closer look at the family at the center of the crime. And welcome back. We're looking ahead now to the trial of George Wagner IV and taking a deeper dive into the family at the center of Ohio's Pike County Massacre and how authorities say they operated. Law and Crime's Anjanette Levy shows us what other acts prosecutors say supports their case for murder.
Prosecutors say that the Wagners lived an insular lifestyle focused on controlling the children and the young women who entered their lives.
Jake Wagner pleaded guilty to 23 charges, including 8 counts of aggravated murder in the deaths of his ex-girlfriend and her family. Prosecutors say the Wagners lived an insular life focused on control of children and the young women who entered their lives. 28-year-old Jake Wagner admitted he and his family plotted and planned for months to murder Hannah Mae Roden and any members of her family who stood in the way of Jake getting sole custody of their daughter. A notice from prosecutors to introduce other acts evidence claims Jake Wagner assaulted, controlled, chased, and threatened to kill Hannah Roden during their relationship and put her body where it would never be found. Prosecutors make similar claims against the Wagners involving Jake's older brother George and his ex-wife and their son. The prosecutor wrote that the Wagners got the woman to sign away almost all of her custody rights under false pretenses and then kept the child from her. The murders in April 2016 were shocking. 8 members of the Roden family shot in the head as they slept in 4 locations. When the Wagners moved to Alaska in 2017, Jake Wagner married a young woman. Court documents say the Wagners threatened to kill the woman and became upset when Jake's daughter started referring to her as mom. Part of the plea agreement for Jake Wagner included taking the death penalty off the table for his mom, his father, and his older brother George.
Angela Wagner pleaded guilty in September of last year. Both she and Jake have agreed to testify against George and Billy Wagner. George Wagner's trial is expected to start next week after being delayed. For Law and Crime Daily, I'm Anjanette Levy.
Anjanette, thank you very much. Jack Rice, 2 members of the Wagner family have already pleaded guilty in this incredible family feud and agreed to testify against the other 2. Now, what are the chances that the brother or the father will also decide to take a plea deal? Somebody has to be prosecuted, right?
Well, they do. And one of the things that is going to happen here is there is a lot of pressure on these 2 to plead. The idea that they could be facing the death penalty and simply saying, do we want to fix this or not? But contemplate what it's like when you have family members who are willing to take the stand against you. They can take you inside. You can have the mom, in this case, take the stand and literally dissect their children in front of them. At the same time, anytime you see something like this, you're going to have jurors who may very well question the motive of those very same people who pled guilty and had to cooperate, because that's part of this agreement. I mean, we use the term snitch regularly, and it actually sticks sometimes. There are those jurors who will simply reject what's being said by somebody if they got a deal in order to testify. And these people did.
So Terry Austin, 8 people were killed allegedly by 4 different defendants. So who pulled the trigger, and how did the prosecution, how did they prove that?
Well, one thing here is it's a conspiracy, so they don't have to necessarily do that. But hopefully the forensic evidence is going to help to tell the real story here. They're going to have to focus on the ballistics. I think that's really critical here. They're going to have to trace the gun purchases, and they should be able to do that. And they also need to trace that ammunition. Where did it come from? Who bought it? They're going to have to also figure out the DNA evidence at the multiple sites. As we know, 8 people were killed. They were in their beds. There were multiple sites. Hopefully we have some fingerprints. Hopefully we have some DNA at any of those sites. And then, as Jack was referring to, we have the testimonies of Jake and Angela. Now, Jake is the one whose child it was that was the center of this custody battle. But we have him testifying. We have Angela testifying, and they both pled guilty. So theoretically, they're going to clarify which of those Wagners went to which of those homes to kill the members, the 8 members of the Roden family and the Gilley families. So with the forensics and with the witnesses, we should be able to determine who exactly pulled those triggers.
What an ugly, emotional case. Jack Rice, Terry Austin, thank you so much for joining us here on Law and Crime. And thanks to all you. We'll see you next time here on Law and Crime as we discuss justice in America.